Okay, so I'm going to start. It's 101. So good morning, good afternoon, bienvenue, and godayan. I hope I have that pronounced correctly. That's for our friends and colleagues from Planet Youth, and translated, I believe it means good day. Okay. My name is Colleen McMillan, and I am the scientific co-director of the KDE Hub, along with my colleague, Dr. Alice Schmidt-Hambich, who is not here today, but in a sunnier climate. We are so glad you are here. Please feel free, like I said, to share the land that you are joining us from or anything else that you would like to share in the chat feature. I don't think it's an understatement to say everyone who is joining today is eager to hear and learn about the topic of social media, gambling, and sleep issues. And so I'm going to keep our introduction short so I can hand it over to our friends and colleagues from Planet Youth. Thank you, Megan, for the welcome slide. And as usual, we will be recording this presentation. I will now start with a land acknowledgement. And Megan, if you could post that slide, that would be great. Thank you. I want to acknowledge that we are on the traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. Renison University College is situated on the Haldimand Tract. That's land promised to the Six Nations in the Haldimand Treaty of 1784. This land includes 6 miles on each side of the Grand River and belongs to the Six Nations, who have stewarded this land through many generations. We acknowledge the enduring presence, knowledge, and philosophies of Indigenous peoples. For this, we are grateful for, but we collectively need to go beyond expressions of gratitude and direct energies into the truth and reconciliation recommendations if our commitment is truly authentic. I also want to let you know that French interpretation is available for this webinar. If you would like to listen in French, you can access the interpretation channel, and that's located in your Zoom feature. And any difficulties, of course, as always, just put a note in the chat, and a member of our KDE team will be happy to assist you. So let's move right into our presentation, something that we've been really eagerly looking for. It's a pleasure to welcome our colleagues and our friends from Planet Youth, Anna Barra and Inga Eva, and I want to say a very warm welcome from Canada, and we are so looking forward to your presentation. For everyone who has joined us, just to let you know that we will be having the presentation, and after the presentation, we will have a designated question and answer period. So hang on to those questions or put them into chat, and we'll do our best to get them all answered up to 12:55, where we'll take a few minutes to do some closing. So over to you, Anna and Inga.
Thank you so much. Can you see my slides in full screen?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you, Colleen, for the introduction. My name is Anna Bára, and thank you everyone for joining us today. We're gonna spend the next 40 minutes looking at 3 topics that often come up separately: social media, gambling, and sleep. What we wanted to do is to slow down and look at what they all have in common. Because very often, when these topics come up, the conversation becomes about individual behavior. How much time young people spend on their phones, whether they are sleeping enough, whether they are making risky choices. And of course, these questions matter, but they are incomplete. I work for Planet Youth, and we want to start from a different place. We start from the assumption that young people are not broken, and they are not failing. They are responding quite rationally often to the environments that they're growing up in. So instead of asking only why young people behave the way they do, we want to ask different questions. What kinds of environments are shaping their choices? Who designs those environments? Who benefits from them? And who is the one that is carrying the risk? So that shift from individuals to environment is what we mean when we talk about upstream prevention. And the pace of change in young people's environments over the past 15 to 20 years has been extraordinary. And when we say that screen time has changed, we are not simply talking about minutes per day. We are talking about earlier access, greater intensity, and a fundamental shift in function. Screens, social media platforms, and digital products are now embedded in everyday life from early childhood and are no longer something that young people do or use occasionally. Social media has become a central space where many young people form their identity, their friendships, and navigate their social life. But at the same time, across many countries, we see a rising concerns about adolescents' mental health, sleep disruption, and new forms of risk behavior. One of the challenges in these conversations is that they often get stuck in debates about correlation versus causation. Was it social media that is causing the mental health crisis? Are screens really to blame? And these debates are definitely important academically, but they are not the most useful place for a start, or useful place to start the conversation for communities, for parents, or policymakers who are they actually the one that need to make that decision right now. So I want to ask you, and we are using Slido for this, and you can join either on your phones or on your laptops. So by your phones, you can scan the QR code or you can go on slido.com and use the code here. So I want to ask you, is today's digital environment reasonably safe for children and adolescents as it exists today? And when I say digital environment, I mean the platforms, games, and the systems young people are spending time in every day. And this is the question that we are facing today. Yeah, this is really interesting. I can see that 43 have participated, and most of you feel that significant changes are needed. Thank you so much for participating. So this question, whether today's digital environment is reasonably safe for children and adolescents, is no longer academic debate. It is now a policy question that governments around the world are actively confronting. And over the past year, several countries have introduced or proposed age-restricted restrictions on social media. Australia was the first one who took the step, where their federal government amended the Online Safety Act to ban children under the age of 16 from holding social media accounts. So they were placing the responsibility on the platforms that they would verify age or face significant fines. So this law came in force in December 2025. But similar discussions are unfolding elsewhere. And there's been actually a lot of development just this week. France has approved a ban on social media for children under the age of 15. And this will be enforced in late 2026. And we just found about this actually on Tuesday this week. Denmark is also drafting a legislation to restrict access for children under the age of 15. In the UK, both government and courts are exploring the Australian-style bans or stricter age verification. We also see some development in Egypt, in Norway, and really all over the place. And I just heard prior to this meeting with Katie Hub that there are similar discussions going on in Canada. It's important to note that these approaches are being questioned. In Australia, young people are, for example, have been challenging the ban, and many researchers and child development experts have raised concerns about the consequences. What we see then is not consensus, but a moment of global experimentation, and there is still active debate about what is the most effective and rightful upstream responses should be. And I by no means plan to give you answer to these questions today, but I want to share some insights that we have. So I want to start to look at screen time and social media use, because before deciding how far regulation should go, we need to understand what the evidence actually tells us about the harm, the mechanisms, and the scale. So we know that now there's a very large and actually a growing body of evidence showing that heavy social media use is associated with a range of harms for adolescents. These include direct harms such as cyberbullying, harassment, and exposure to harmful content. But they also include indirect harms such as increased risk of anxiety, depression, and social comparison. What is really important is that this evidence is no longer only comes from observational studies, because now we have experimental evidence showing that when young people reduce their social media use, their mental health actually improves. And some of the actual causal evidence comes from internal research conducted by the platform companies themselves, like from Meta. And this matters because it changes the nature of the conversation, because we are no longer asking about whether harm exists. The evidence is now extensive, and it's consistent. So the question is now, how are we going to respond? And to respond effectively, we need to understand mechanisms. Social media platforms are commercial products designed to capture and hold attention. We have algorithms that prioritize content that creates engagement and are often triggered by strong emotional responses. We have features such as infinity scroll, notifications, and public metrics that are definitely not accidental. They are all design choices. It is also important to think about what time spent on screens is replacing. We know that time is limited, especially for young people who are balancing a lot of things like school, family life, and social relationships. So hours that are being absorbed by screens are hours that are not being spent on homework, organized leisure activities, physical activity, sleep, or even face-to-face interactions with friends or family. And these are all activities that we know are protective for both well-being and for development. Now, place those design choices into adolescence, a period of development characterized by increased sensitivity to peer evaluation, social belonging, and identity formation. Result is an environment that increases comparison, pressure, and emotional imbalance. It is not that all young people are harmed in the same way. Some young people, of course, benefit from connection and support online, but there are others who are far more vulnerable, especially those who are already experiencing stress, exclusion, or mental health challenges. This is why individual self-regulation is a weak prevention strategy. Because even us as adults, we struggle to regulate the use in these environments. So if we are expecting young people to do so consistently and independently, it is really ignoring how these systems are actually designed. So if we look at screen time and social media use through an upstream lens, the key question is not why young people struggle to set boundaries, but why do we expect them to do so in environments that make boundaries so hard? Social media platforms are designed to encourage constant checking, and social expectations reinforce it because the friends, they are expecting fast replies. The group chats keep moving, and being seen creates a real pressure. A big driver is habit formation through variable rewards, which is actually the same principle as a slot machine. You scroll on your phone or refresh, and sometimes you get something great, a funny video, sometimes a message from your friend, a like, and that unpredictability really trains you to keep checking your phone. Platforms are also removing like natural stopping points because they have integrated infinity scroll and autoplay. So there are no clear moments to stop the use. And they also use some really strong cues to trigger automatic behavior. They have red notification badges, vibration pings, lock screen previews, and they empathize social reinforcement with likes, with comments, and follower counts to make social approval visible. And then we have all the short videos, the reels, that really do add another layer to this all. They are so fast, the videos, the cuts and captions really keep the attention really locked in. So the issue is not a weak willpower of our youth. It is that young people are being asked to self-regulate inside systems that are designed to pull attention and to make opting out socially costly. So I think it's time now to start thinking upstream. And here are some examples of upstream approaches for screen time and social media use. At the household level, upstream approaches often start with a clear and simple rules, such as just keeping phones out of the bedrooms at night or protecting shared family time. That can be that there are no screens while they're having dinner together. But we know that household rules are much more effective when they are supported by shared norms that are beyond the family. Because young people find it much harder to switch off if they are the only ones that are doing so. And this is where school environments play an important role. One upstream approach at school level is to create phone-free environments during the school day. This does not necessarily mean banning phones altogether. In many cases, students can still bring their devices or phones to school, but they are kept somewhere safe and are not used during lessons or breaks. And when phones are removed from constant reach, the pressure to be online drops for everyone at once. Importantly, this works best when something else fills the space, and this is a really important point. They must have something else to do instead. This can be board games, shared activities, and spaces for face-to-face interaction. Another upstream tool is the parental agreements. These are not school rules and they are not laws. They are agreements made by parents together within a community. In Iceland, parental agreements have been used for many years as part of a broader prevention efforts. Parents sit down together and they agree on a small number of shared expectations, so children grow up with similar boundaries across families. These may include delaying smartphones until a certain age, not allowing social media use before it's permitted by platform rules or laws, or agreeing on shared expectations around evening screen time or screen use. And parental agreements are especially helpful when they are put in place early, before the behavior actually becomes established. Once young people are already using smartphones or social media regularly, changing patterns can be quite difficult. And this is not because of lack of willpower, but because of habits, social expectations, and peer norms that are already in place. But what makes parental agreements powerful is not the specific rule, but the shared commitment. When parents act together, children are less likely to feel singled out, and families are less likely to feel they are the only ones saying no. And finally, an environmental support at the system level also matters a lot. We have phone-free zones, parental settings, and default protections that can reduce friction for families. We also need to ask whether age restrictions for social media and video games are being followed, and whether enforcement is adequate. These approaches do not remove social media, like they have been doing all over the world right now, but they do help make healthier choices more realistic for families. Now I want to speak briefly about sleep in relation to screen time. And we all know how important sleep is. Sleep is a very good example of how downstream problems reflect upstream design choices. Many adolescents today are not getting enough sleep, and the sleep that they are getting is often poorly timed or disrupted. And this is rarely about a single behavior. Research, including the work by Lucy Wolfe and others, consistently show that adolescent sleep is shaped by a combination of biological, social, and structural factors. Young people naturally fall asleep later, but many of the systems that they live in require them to wake up early. And evenings are often filled with stimulation. Screen use plays a role, but so do organized activities, sport practices, homework, and social expectations. And in some cases, activities even start before school. When schedules are packed in both ends of the day, sleep is often the first thing that gets sacrificed. And I think that many adults recognize this pattern in their own lives as well. Structural factors matter too. In rural setting, young people often have to get much earlier to catch buses, and many spend a long time commuting to and from school. These are not choices made by the young people or their families, but features of how education and transport systems are organized. And when we put all of this together, it becomes clear that sleep is not just about bedtime routines. It is shaped by the environments young people move through every day. If we look at sleep through an upstream lens, the focus shifts from telling young people to go to bed earlier to asking how we can design environments that make sleep possible. One important upstream approach is creating evening environments that support wind down. Many young people move directly from school to activities, to screens, and then straight into bed with a little transition in between. Evenings are often filled with stimulation, social interactions, and expectations to stay connected. And from a biological perspective, it makes it so much harder for the body and the brain to slow down. So supporting wind down is less about strict routines and more about a predictable rhythms. This can include sequencing activities so that stimulating activities happen bit earlier in the evening and the calmer activities later. Reducing the noise and light levels over time and protecting certain parts of the evenings from a high stimulation. These kind of environment cues help to signal that the day is about to end and rest is approaching. With this broader evening environment, screen use plays a particularly important role. Screens and social media, especially, are designed to be engaging and emotionally activating. When screen use extended late into the evening, it competes directly with sleep, but delaying wind down and increasing alertness. Upstream approaches therefore also include limiting screen use in the evenings, especially close to bedtime. This can involve keeping screens out of bedrooms, reducing notification and alerts at night, and protecting the last part of the evening from a highly stimulating digital content. And these approaches work best when they apply to everyone in the household, not only the adolescents. And when they are supported by shared expectations rather than individual enforcement. But school structures also matter here. And there is a growing evidence that later school start times are associated with longer sleep duration and better outcomes for adolescents. In Iceland, this is especially hard because we have so much darkness during winter, and I know that you have that too in Canada. But in Iceland, actually, some primary schools have delayed start times for the teenagers, for 13 to 15-year-olds, to support their sleep better. And this is an example of systems that is adapting to young people's needs rather than expecting young people to adapt to systems. Upstream responses also mean looking at the full daily schedule, how early the day starts, how late it ends, and how much travel time is involved, and how activities are distributed across the week. When these structures are aligned, young people are less likely to be sleep deprived. And this is where prevention has a real leverage. By changing environments and expectations, we reduce the burden on individuals and create conditions where healthy sleep is more realistic for more young people. Finally, I want to speak a little bit about gambling that can take many forms, as you can see here. And gambling is increasingly relevant for youth prevention, even though it is often overlooked. Many young people are exposed to gambling earlier than many of you might realize. And this is often through digital games that include betting, chance, and in-game purchases. In many games, children and adolescents are drawn into what is essentially a compulsion loop. They perform an action, they receive a reward, and a new opportunity opens. And the cycle repeats. Progress can often be sped up by spending money, for example, by buying gems to open chests or upgrades, using real money to purchase virtual currency such as V-Bucks for skins or battle passes, or buying boosters and extra lives. And these gambling-like mechanisms normalize risk-taking and spending behaviors long before young people ever actually place a formal bet. The boundaries between gaming and gambling has become increasingly blurred. This normalization is further reinforced through advertising, sports sponsorship, and online influencers and role models who promote gambling as an entertainment or success. Accessibility also plays a role. Gambling opportunities are now highly visible and easy to access through digital platforms. And we see this reflected in data. Gambling is now part of the Planet Youth Core questionnaire. And the findings from the European School Survey Project on Alcohol and Other Drugs, or so-called ASPAT, show that a notable proportion of young people report gambling activities. And this pattern is actually similar to other public health issues: early exposure, normalization, commercial promotion, and blurred boundaries between entertainment and risk. In Canada, we have, of course, seen this trajectory before with tobacco and alcohol. And in each case, upstream action followed it once it became clear that individual responsibility alone was not enough. Gambling is following a similar pattern, but it's faster because it's all digital. So I'm going to show you a little bit from the ASPAT on European data. And it is actually showing that gambling among young people is not an unknown issue. So across Europe, we can see around 1 in 4 students are reporting gambling for money in the past 12 months. And in some countries, like unfortunately Iceland, the rates are closer to 40%. What is important here is not just how many young people gamble, but how and where gambling takes place. We know that gambling occurs both in land-based setting and online. And online gambling is particularly relevant because its accessibility and overlap with digital environments that young people are already inhabiting. The ASPAT study also shows a clear gender differences in many countries, with boys reporting higher rates of gambling. And this is also in what we see in the Planet Youth data so far. But in some contexts, including Iceland, rates among boys and girls are very similar. If we look at gambling through an upstream lens, research is very clear about one thing. The most effective responses focuses on environments, not individual behavior. A consistent finding across studies, including the work that is being summarized by ASPAT and other public health reviewers, is that exposure and availability matters. When gambling opportunities are visible, accessible, and embedded in everyday activities, participation increases, and this is especially among young people. Upstream approaches therefore prioritize reducing this exposure, and this is especially done in environments where children and adolescents are present. So this includes limiting gambling, advertising, sports sponsorship, and promoting content that reaches young audiences, as well as addressing the role of influencers and role models who normalize gambling. Research also points to the importance of regulating gambling-like mechanisms in digital products. Features such as loot boxes, chance-based rewards, skins, and in-game purchases operate using the same psychological principle as gambling. And when these mechanisms are embedded in games marketed to young people, they effectively act as early exposure to gambling systems. Upstream prevention requires clearer regulation and separation between gaming and gambling. Another upstream lever is enforcement, not just rules. Age limits for gambling, gaming, and online payment system exist in many contexts, but evidence shows that they are often poorly enforced. Strengthening age verification, limiting access to payment methods, and addressing easy credit options are all structural measures that reduce harm more effectively than education alone. And finally, timing matters as well. Research consistently shows that prevention is the most effective when it happens before behaviors and norms are established. Once gambling behavior become habitual, they are much harder to change. This is why gambling now explicitly belongs in youth prevention discussions alongside social media and substance use rather than being just treated as a separate or adult-only issue. So taken together, the evidence tells us that environmental responses are not only possible, they are necessary. Gambling-related harm is shaped by access, design, and commercial initiatives, and it requires system-level responses, not just individual responsibility. So when we look at upstream responses in Canada, it is important to note that many of these conversations are already happening. In different ways, across different levels, we can see a growing recognition that environments matter a lot, and that individual responsibility alone is not enough. At a school level, many provinces and school boards have introduced clearer rules around smartphone use during the school day. At a federal level, Canada is also moving towards a greater accountability for online platforms. A proposed legislation such as the Online Harms Act reflect a shift towards recognizing that digital environments can create risk for children and adolescents, and that platforms themselves have a responsibility to reduce harm. We also see upstream responses emerging at the level of platform design. Some social media platforms are experimenting with age-based protections and prompts that encourage young people to disengage during school hours or late in the day. And Canadian public health research further reinforced the need for these approaches. Studies have shown a clear association between intensive social media use and poorer sleep health among adolescents, and this especially among the girls. This helps explain why sleep disruption has become so widespread and why screen use and sleep need to be addressed together rather in isolation. We also have national survey data and the Planet Youth surveys that are also showing that young people with a very high screen time are more likely to report symptoms of anxiety, depression, and psychological distress. And finally, I want to mention the Canada's 24-hour movement guidelines that also provide important upstream reference point. And these guidelines empathize the balance across sleep, physical activity, leisure-based screen time, and they reflect the public health understanding that well-being is shaped by how much time how time is being distributed across the day. So taken together, these examples show that upstream prevention is not a future idea in Canada. It is already underway. And the challenge now is coherence, aligning school policies, platform designs, public health evidence, and community norms so the healthier choices become the easier ones and more realistic for young people. I would like to close by coming back to what these topics have in common. Social media use, sleep disruption, and gambling are often discussed as separate issues, but what we have tried to show here today is that they are shaped by the same upstream forces. Commercial design, accessibility, social norms, and policy choices all influence how young people spend their time, what they're exposed to, and how much pressure they are experiencing. And young people are not failing to regulate themselves. They are responding to environments that are fast-paced, stimulating, and difficult to disengage from. And when those environments operate at scale, even small effects accumulate and show up at the population level. And this is why individual responsibility alone is not a sufficient prevention strategy. Prevention works best when responsibility is shared across families, schools, communities, platforms, and policymakers. And the good news is that upstream responses are possible. We have seen examples of today how environments can be reshaped through school policies, shared norms, and design choices, through regulation and public health guidance. And none of these actions work on their own, but together they can reduce pressure on young people and make healthier choices more realistic and more reasonable. But I want to mention that upstream prevention is not about controlling behavior. It's about aligning environments with what we know supports healthy development for our youth. When we do that, we create conditions where young people can thrive, not because they are more disciplined, but because the world around them is working with them, not against them. So thank you very much. I look forward to the discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anna. That was absolutely fascinating. And I'm sure that there's multiple questions in the chat. So my understanding is, Annette, will you facilitate the questions, and Inga, you will be responding to them? Okay, sounds good.
Okay, so we have a question here from Andrew, and whether there's a distinction between games of chance and, or is there a distinction necessary? I apologize. Necessary games of chance and gambling, or does participation in games of chance inevitably lead to an inclination to gamble? Are there structural elements that can be embedded in games of chance that can mitigate an evolutionary relationship with gambling?
Yeah, I think this is a very good question. I think inevitably we can probably remove that, because I do think games of chance and gambling, they're not the same. And I don't think that all of those who participate in games of chance will end up gambling. But I definitely think there are these structural elements that we need to think about, because these are really young kids that start in this in these games. So being exposed to these gambling-like features, and then if that is to become the norm as they grow older, as we are seeing happening in Iceland now and in other countries of the Europe, where there are online casinos and gambling and gaming, and it's really easy, and it's no longer that you're gambling on, for example, one sports game. You're gambling on all the outcomes. Is someone gonna get a penalty? Who is gonna hurt themselves? And these are all kinds of things that you can gamble on. So I definitely think we need to be cautious with this element, but I don't think that it's gonna lead to an inclination necessarily to gambling, but we don't know, just to say. Anna, you want to add to this maybe?
No, I think you have covered it quite well.
Okay, there's a kind of a comment, maybe more so, and I wonder if Christina Kells, you wanted to unmute and speak to this, but the comment is, I wonder if the new OPHS, which are the Ontario Public Health Standards, will have some of this direction for public health units, especially to work on policy. Christina, did you want to comment on that further?
Sure. Well, I guess it's just about who is responsible for these system changes and policy, and what is the role for public health, because public health will take its direction from, the Ministry of Health, which writes the Ontario Public Health Standards. So I'm just wondering, I haven't seen the Ontario Public Health Standards. The new ones are coming out really soon. So I just, would be great if they had, some direction for public health units to address this. I hope that explains it. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. It definitely helps to facilitate these kinds of best practices or recommended practices if it's coming with the policy support. Heather or Panna has her hand up.
Yeah. Sorry. Thank you for an incredibly informative and inspiring talk. So thank you so much. I'm Heather Rapana. I'm with the Public Health Agency of Canada, and I work in our Centre for Surveillance and Applied Research. And one of the things that I was thinking as you were talking is how we can think about using measurement to also help move people upstream. So when we're doing measurement and monitoring and surveillance, almost always the unit of analysis is the individual. And I wonder if that's one of the reasons why we drift downstream towards individual responsibility and individual behavior. And I was wondering if anyone here had any thoughts about how do we shift our focus towards upstream interventions by looking at the unit of analysis as the community.
Yeah, I think this is a very good question. Most of the surveys that we do, we're measuring from the individual, what the individual is reporting on. Sometimes there are questions about their social environment, their lived environment. So there is actually a way of measuring some of these things. But we could also measure, let's say there was to be a change in how devices are sold to people under 16 and that they would have to have the default settings on. We could measure, are the default health settings on these types of devices, for example. So if we're going to measure what activities or actions are being, what we're seeing change across time, if I'm being clear. But then we could also ask, just in terms of when we are asking individuals, asking more about their social environment and the lived experience, then we would have a measurement that we could use at least to measure if we're seeing a change in the social environment. Anna, you want to add to this?
No, just overall, I think like the youth surveys are great way to see where things are approaching and to move more upstream, to think about the population as a whole rather than placing the responsibility on the individuals themselves.
Okay, so we have a few more questions that have come in, and there's a theme here of, I think, centering the youth themselves. So one comment is just around how youth are finding ways to kind of get around bans, for example, using VPNs. And then Dan is wondering if there's opportunities to have youth advocate for changes in games policies, apps, so that the changes are not just coming from adults. And the challenge part being that games are super popular and part of many youth's weekly routine. But I think, maybe a question here about, are there ways to empower and support youth in making some of these changes or advocating for some of these changes?
Yeah, I think definitely youth should have a seat at the table, but then at the end of the day, I do think it is the responsibility of the adults to create healthy environments. So if we are seeing, if evidence is pointing towards the direction that something is harmful, not for all youth, but let's say for many youth, then that is something that should be addressed. Because I don't think necessarily youth have a problem with the games. I mean, I have 3 children and they love all of these games, and it's a battle in having screen limits and family time and trying to, I see from the comments here where many of us dealing with the same things, trying to allow them to participate, but not so much that it hurts their mental health or other things that they should be doing. I've never heard them describe Clash Royale as being addictive, but based on how much they play it, I'm sure it has some features to it. So I don't know how we would approach it. Is it something that the video game platforms would offer Would we raise the topic among you people that this isn't necessarily also good for your mental health, and that's why you should move on to video games like they were in the old days? I mean, this is also a matter of when do we need to adapt to the environmental changes and when not. Yeah, but definitely having youth at the table, but I don't know if that's going to impact how games are going to be designed unless there's a very strong motive for games to change. And we will see that very in the near future, how the pressure of, for example, the government bans on social media will force the social media companies to change because they will have to adapt somehow. This is a huge clientele that they don't want to lose. So there is going to be some, I don't know, backlash or solutions that they're going to come up with. And if I'm not answering the questions fully, just feel free to say, but I meant this.
And we will probably be seeing this from the social media companies very soon, because like these conversations are going like really fast around the globe right now, and a lot of discussions going on whether social media should be altogether banned for young people, 15 or 16.
Okay, Jessica, would you like to jump in with your question?
Sure, it kind of builds on the conversation that we were just having there, but more so around that social norm from a parenting perspective is how do you, or is there any examples that you can build on to share how you motivate parents to want to see change in this? Because there's also this burnout of parents of all the expectations in a parenting world of this, and I'm wondering how they're prioritizing this over top of other things. When you might even within one family unit have one parent that's permissive, whatever, go ahead and have screen time, no problem. And the other parent that is like, this is not good. This is affecting your behavior, your sleep, all of those pieces. Do you have examples of how you would get to this social cohesiveness of parenting, social norms and parenting agreements at schools? We've seen it here in Ontario with some of our school boards trying to restrict cell phones in the classroom. And when the parents just allow for the cell phone to get to school anyway. So then the teachers have to take the phone in the class, and then the teachers are getting reprimanded by the parents. How dare you take my child's phone? These kinds of behaviors that are happening. Any examples or support on that?
I think this is a very good question and very valid. And we see, I've been talking about this and doing research in the line of social media and its impact on youth mental health since 2012. And I will definitely say that today there is much, much, much more momentum for parents to create norms around this, to kind of try to have an agreement on how they want this to be in their household. People didn't really think about it to begin with. It was just there and everyone was using it, and we didn't really think about how it might impact youth. That being said, stepping in very late is difficult. I can just, from personal experience, we can see that if there isn't consensus within a parent group, for example, if you're going to discuss it at a class setting or a community setting, and there isn't consensus, people want to raise their children their own way, and I fully respect that. Then it's really difficult. So starting very early, having these conversations, like Anna was telling me yesterday, having these conversations in kindergarten, for example. I think knowledge might be good as well for parents, and that has changed a lot in recent years. Just the recommendations of screen time for young children. That's something that we see now, that parents are made aware that screens that I think it's younger than 2 years shouldn't be exposed to screens. That is fairly, like iPads in front of them, that is fairly recent as well. So having conversations on consensus early on is beneficial. When there is a loss of consensus, then it's really much down to the individual to do what they think is best for their child. Unfortunately, unless we have the systems in place to support us, you can't go in to your child's classroom and say, hey, now we're all going to have screen-free environments if 90% of the parents don't want it. Anna, you want to add?
No, just maybe to the point about kindergartens. I am in a parental committee for my child in kindergarten, and I was reading through their plans, and I actually asked if we could have education for parents about the harms of screen time for our children, because we know that parents of younger children are more likely to listen, and then we usually do not have as much issues with screens.
I see we have a question from Gail.
Yeah, thank you for this presentation. Very, very interesting. I'm a university educator and I struggle with this all the time in my classrooms. I see it in the form of students not coming to class, coming in late, asking for extensions on assignments, not being able to focus in class, and just craving continual engagement. It's like you're having to play up to the role as an instructor with these kinds of things. And I don't live my life in that platform world. I abhor it, actually. And one of the things I've been trying to do is some confidence building exercises where students are actually leading their own day and creating their own assignments and facilitating those to get them away from the screen and just talking. But a lot of what I do is app-based. I'm on a course platform. Students are online reading research articles. They are texting each other to complete assignments. And I suspect that's not helping this cycle, but what would you suggest I think about or consider as an alternative? What could I do?
Well, that's a good question. I struggle with this as well. I teach at the University of Reykjavik, and I see this all the time in students where they're just obviously not listening and have fully zoned out into their own world. My take on that is that they're there at their own free will, signed up to learn something, and it is their responsibility to learn it there. But if you have them online, is that what you said? It's all online teaching?
Not online teaching, but course materials are online on a platform. My learning resources I share with them are online resources. So they're taken into this digital world on purpose. And I do it for 24/7 access and for more palatable materials that are for public consumption to learn about course related concepts rather than dry academic journals or textbooks. Real world relevance in the classroom, right, is what I'm trying to establish. But I was talking with a colleague about doing some research around mental health promotion and developing a tool with my students about this so that they can function better in their own workplaces rather than having this obsession or what they call an addiction. And I was talking to my colleague about developing an app, and now I'm hearing this webinar. I'm thinking, I don't know, I'm not sure about that now. People are talking about apps as solutions, as ways of connecting people, but is it just adding fuel to the flames?
Maybe. But I think there are some really good suggestions in the chat. And maybe thinking about when you do have them in person, focusing more than on these connections and have shared assignments. So if you can focus on having individual assignments when they're by themselves, but more like group assignments when you have them together, and that would foster connection and confidence and respect for others. and the opinions of others, which is often I find challenging when you're teaching as well, is that is something that needs to be taught.
Yeah. And that's such a good point. And I'm going to just jump in here, Anna and Inga, because I think you can tell we could go on much longer, but we've come to the end of our hour. And I have so many comments here, but I'm going to suffice it just to say I thank you to the both of you for bringing in the evidence. And I'm really glad that you moved beyond the academic debate and into this evidence that's both international and really robust, and just making us think more upstream of a individual issue. You know, I took away such good quotes about, you know, individual issues being reflected in systems, and how we have to remove that expectation of expecting the adolescent to fit into the system versus the system accommodating the adolescent. So thank you. I'm just going to take 60 seconds here. I'll make this really quick for everyone. As you leave, there will be a short pop-up survey, and if you could just respond to us. Your information, your feedback, your comments are always appreciated, and it really helps us to know what kind of knowledge products to develop, so that we can support you and the important work that you're doing in your community around health promotion, mental health promotion. We also want to make sure that you visit the Hub page. We have a wide variety of topics, see what our new products are. And lastly, give us some feedback on that. And again, thank you for joining us today. Thank you to our guests. And stay warm, everyone. We'll see you at our next webinar.